Welcome, everyone. I'm Erin Scott. I'm the Director of Capacity Building and Community Knowledge at the Columbus Foundation, and I'm so glad you could join us. This is part of our commitment to effective philanthropy, which includes investing in nonprofit professionals like all of you who are leading change every day in our communities. And we're so grateful that you could spend this hour with us. Today's session, Enhancing Leadership Through Listening Skills, has specifically been developed for you. And it's part two of our three-part nonprofit forum series titled Nonprofit Communication Strategies and Tools. So in this session, we'll explore how deeper listening can transform the way we meet, communicate, and collaborate with each other. Listening isn't just about hearing, it's about understanding perspectives, uncovering insights, and creating space where every voice matters. So together, today, we're going to learn more about the 5 levels of listening, common barriers that get in our way, and practical skills to become more conscious and effective listeners. So we're absolutely thrilled to be joined today by an exceptional coach from Articulation, which is a Columbus-based firm that helps leaders become unforgettable communicators. Acacia Duncan is the Director of Coaching and Training at Articulation and a longtime trainer, speaker, and stage actor. She's coached hundreds of professionals, from CEOs to first-time presenters, and brings decades of experience helping people communicate with purpose, precision, and passion. She also has experience as a nonprofit founder with Available Light Theater, where she's also been a stage director. So before I hand it off to Acacia, just a few quick Zoom housekeeping notes. If you need live captions, click the 3 dots in the black bar at the bottom of your screen and select the captioning options. Or if you see the CC at the bottom, you can click that for the closed captions. Please use the chat box to submit questions at any time. So for any technical issues, you can also use the chat box and someone from our team will assist you. A follow-up email will be sent today with presentation materials and a feedback survey, so please complete that. And this session is being recorded and will be available for viewing on our YouTube channel in the coming weeks. So thank you for being here. And now I'll turn things over to Acacia from Articulation.
Thank you so much, Erin. I couldn't think of a better way to spend my lunch break here on this Wednesday afternoon than to be with you all. I'm looking at the chat here and seeing all of the different organizations that are represented in this room. And it's really lovely and quite extraordinary. Because today, we are going to talk about listening, and so there will be hopefully some learning for you. But today is also about community. So as we go through the day today, it's going to be an interactive session. That's why we're in a Zoom meeting instead of a webinar, because we want to be able to hear your voice and hear from your experiences. So today, throughout the session, there are going to be a couple of interactive polls for you to participate in. You can look forward to those. I encourage active participation in the chat. And so feel free to put questions and comments in the chat. We'll have Erin and Lee paying attention to that in case I miss anything. There will be opportunities also to come off mute. So we do love to hear other voices. I don't want you to just hear my voice today. So please consider coming off mute when you feel comfortable. And there will be one breakout activity today. Now, I know not everyone will necessarily be connected to Zoom in a way that allows them to go to a breakout room. Never fear, if you get stuck in the main room during the breakout session, we'll take care of you here and we'll have the same activity going in the main room. Today, I am a guide to you. These ideas around listening, they are not revolutionary, and many of them you have experienced or thought about in some way. You have some level of knowledge on this subject. So today, in order to make a good day for yourself, I really invite you to listen with a curious and open beginner's mind. Set yourself in this moment, take a quiet moment, and give yourself an intention for how you want to listen for the next 65 minutes. And now I'm going to start with an anecdote. So President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, way back in the day, he was really known for having a boisterous personality and a really big, ready grin. I mean, there was a reason he was such a successful politician. But Even he, who loved people and loved interacting with them, started to wonder if it really mattered what he was doing, especially when he would have to stand in these long receiving lines at the White House, shaking everyone's hand and making small talk. So one day he decided to try a little bit of an experiment. And as the guests were coming through, he would reach out his hand to shake their hand, and he said, I murdered my grandmother this morning. Now, most people actually responded with sort of the automatic responses of, oh, how lovely, and oh, keep up the good work, Mr. President. They clearly weren't listening. But then one diplomat who was coming through the line after the president reached out and said, I murdered my grandmother this morning. This diplomat responded softly, I'm sure she had it coming, sir. So it is true, of course, that it is really difficult to listen. And I'm looking around the room right now, and if you want to use your raise hand emoji or just thumbs up or write in the chat, how many of you have ever felt that you weren't really heard? Yeah, I'm seeing a whole ton of thumbs up happening, raising hands as well. I always feel if I give this long enough, everyone is going to respond. We've all had that feeling at some point. And, I kind of believe that if we've all felt at some point that we were not really heard, we have probably all been guilty of being the person who wasn't really hearing the other person. So today is all about talking about that listening and how we can cultivate a deeper listening practice. I'm going to share my screen now. So we're going to move to a PowerPoint. And it is really a shame that listening can be something that people don't always feel that they get, especially from leaders, because listening is truly a key tool of any leader. And I use that word really widely. Whether you're an individual contributor or you manage people, you really are a leader, whatever your role. And listening is going to play a part in your ability to be effective. So, in our chat, our first official chat question of the day, I want you to think about what you believe are some of the benefits of listening well, particularly in your work. And just add it to the chat. As people write in the chat, if you are willing to come off mute and share your perspective on a benefit of listening well, raise your hand and I can call on you. So a benefit is grasping nuance. Jason, can you maybe, if you're willing to come off mute, tell us what the benefit is of grasping that nuance? What comes as an outcome from that?
Oh, just the idea that all the things that are not the words being spoken, right? That you can always hear what's actually being said if you are paying attention and really listening.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, Jason. I'm seeing some interesting things in here about really getting different perspectives, understanding things. Many people in that grasp world that you were talking about, Jason, as well, here in the chat. And I'm going to build on this a little bit for you all, just based on some research that has been done around listening. And there are studies that show that managers who are really adept in listening are seen by their employees as superior leaders. And very importantly, they foster more inclusive environments. This might be those different perspectives that some of you were writing about in the chat. And also, employees who feel that they're heard are 4.6 times more likely to feel empowered to excel. And then lastly, people who are adept listeners are 42% better in their sales performance. And I know that we're not necessarily salespeople in this room, but you are often selling the mission of your organization and selling people on your ideas. And it's the listeners who seem to succeed the best. And we do know some other things about listening as well. One, we know that we spend almost half of our time, our awake time, I should say, listening to other people speak. And we have learned about 85% of what we know by listening to other people, right? So we're really learning from speaking. We're spending a lot of time speaking. But unfortunately, most of us only listen at about a 25% efficiency. So we're not listening particularly well. And this last piece of data makes my training and development heart so sad. And that is we don't retain what we hear very well. 1 hour after you leave this webinar, I will be lucky if you remember 20% of what we talked about. Now, I do want to pause here. We're going to be talking about listening today, but I would not be a great communication professional if I didn't point out that this last statistic, it's really important when you consider your important communications to boards of directors or to donors or to constituents or your team. Because the more information you cram into your communication, the less likely you will know what they retain, because they're only going to retain 20%. So that's a little sidebar. We're going to come back to listening though, because with all of this in mind, we know that we're listening a lot. We know we don't do it well. We know it's important. It's sad to know that only about 2% of people ever receive any formal training on listening. Now, in this room, I kind of think it might be a little bit higher. My gut tells me that. So if you've received formal training on listening, I wonder if you can either put in the chat or give a quick thumbs up right now. Amy. Thank you, Amy. What's your profession, Amy? Like, how would you describe your profession?
So I work at the Franklin County Fairgrounds as the
Mhm.
manager, but I also have a very large influence in the role of a 4-H volunteer. So over the years, it's been a very key component in educating young people to be a good listener and to actually teach that listening aspect to them as well as they become camp counselors and older youth to be able to show the value of listening.
Yeah, so I'm hearing that you really got some of your formal training in listening as you were preparing to teach other people how to listen as well. That's
Yes, and
terrific.
in speaking classes, they teach you you need to listen as equally as important as speaking.
Absolutely. Do we have any therapists in the room or trained social workers in the room? Those are fields that often have formal training on listening. Occasionally, lawyers also get formal training on listening. But we're really kind of anemic in how we talk about listening. So it is a huge opportunity. And I'm going to look at the positive side of it, which means it probably isn't going to take a lot for everyone to be able to level up. So as you listen today, we're going to talk about strategies to cultivate your own ability to listen well. And as we do that, let's start with thinking about a person who's a good listener. We all know at least one. And Lee, I'm going to get ready to launch that first poll in a moment. So bring that listener into your mind. Actually picture them. Yes, therapists count. You may notice that there aren't a lot to choose from, but try and narrow in on one or two of them. And then ask yourself, what characterizes this person? What qualities come into your mind when you think of them? And see if you can narrow that down to one or two words. Lee, would you go ahead and launch that poll for everyone? Thank you all. We're getting a lot of participation. I'm going to wait till we get to about 60%. All right, I'll give you 10 more seconds to fill in, and then we're going to stop the poll. All right. Lee, let's go ahead and end that poll and share the results with everyone. You will have to click if you're wanting to share the results, you can click the view details and you'll get a pop-up window. But I'm seeing a lot of words like patience and attentiveness, learner, eye contact, curiosity and compassion, caring, empathy. If we did this as a word cloud, I think we would see a lot of that empathy and eye contact and compassion coming up. Beautiful. I'm going to go ahead and stop that share now and come back to our content. So it's really my view, all of these things are qualities we probably all want to have. And it's my view that everyone comes into interactions and they want to be a good listener. I don't think anybody really starts their day thinking, boy, I hope I hear nothing that anyone wants to say today. I really don't want to hear anything. But it is really rare to have good listening. And that's because there are some really significant barriers to listening well. I could ask you all what those barriers are, but in order to get to the tips quickly, I'm going to go through the major categories of barriers. So if you were thinking of what gets in the way, it might fall into one of these categories. And the first, of course, is distractions. It's really hard to listen deeply if your attention is in multiple places. And it's hard not to have your attention in multiple places these days. I mean, we have these attention stealing devices. In fact, I'm going to take my watch off for the rest of the day today, so nothing will buzz me while I'm talking to you and trying to listen to you. And in fact, studies show that 75% of our time is spent preoccupied and distracted. And that is a lot of time when you're not able to listen at your best. So one of the easiest ways to listen better when you need to is to try and remove those distractions. The second category is a little more amorphous. So this is the category of wants. It's really hard to listen deeply when we want something. Picture it. You're in a conversation, maybe with someone who means a lot to you, and you're trying to figure out what you're going to do for an upcoming vacation together. But you already know, I want to go to the beach. So you really want them to say that they want to go to the beach too. And that means as you're listening, it's going to be harder to listen deeply to what they're actually telling you. And this want thing can be really insidious because when we're communicating, we do usually have goals and objectives. So you're constantly balancing between your goal and objective and the objective to listen deeply. Heck, even wanting to be a good listener can diminish your ability to be a good listener as it turns your focus inward. So today, in just a little bit, we're going to talk about setting intentions and how intentions can be a great way to work within this want category. And then the last category of things that get in our way are fears. It's so easy to get pulled out of listening if you are worried about what the other person is thinking or feeling, or if there's a lot at stake in the conversation. Or maybe you're just worried that you might run out of time and you really have something to say. All of these internal stressors will narrow our ability to listen. So as we get to the end of our session today, we'll talk about how you can anchor yourself to help with this barrier. So in the chat, if you want to put in additional barriers to listening that you've experienced, or maybe which one of these is the hardest for you, feel free. But I do also want to pause to note that we should acknowledge that there's a lot of neurodiversity around this topic. A person's ability to listen may also be tied to some ways in which their brains function. But I still believe that listening is on a spectrum, and no matter who you are, you can cultivate a deeper ability. This is great. Thank you guys for being so active in the chat. Different cultures. Hamida, do you mind if you're willing to come off mute? I'd love to hear how that has impacted your ability to listen or other people's ability to listen.
Yes, sure. Yeah, I can. So like I came like as a migrant. So like in 2019, so when I came, like we find like different culture here in America. So it's hard to be like to be a good listener or like someone else to help you because of the culture is different and the language. Language is the hardest things like to focus, like to help, to get help or like to help others. This is my I think my experience here.
I'm so grateful that you shared that. I hear that having that different language barrier or culture barrier, if it's not a language barrier, can make it difficult not only for others to listen, but for you to listen to them too, as deeply as you might in your native language or native culture.
Yes.
Thank you, Hamida. That's really useful to think about.
You're welcome.
Great. Oh, Lori, I just saw you come up, and Lori, I feel you in my heart of hearts. My overwhelming need to problem solve and help people does also get in my way of listening. Thank you for your honesty there. I'm sure you're not the only one. Awesome. All right. Well, then let's move into cultivating our ability to listen. And we're going to start by just acknowledging that listening is really hard. It takes energy. And so one thing we can do is begin to treat it like the hard thing it is to do. So now we are actually going to warm up just like we would if we were an athlete. And we're going to do a quick exercise of listening. It's pretty easy. What I'm going to do is I'm going to set my timer here. And we're going to all just listen for 60 seconds. I invite you to try and remove distractions so you can fully participate in this activity. And as you're listening for those 60 seconds, if you want something to do, you can try to listen close to you. What do you hear? And then you can try and expand your listening outward. What's going on in the room around you, the building outside, all the way to the highways. How far can you listen? We're going to listen for 60 seconds, starting now. That was 60 seconds. Oh, I would love to hear all the things you heard. Like I actually heard a ringing in my ear, and I heard birds, and I heard cars. My husband came home. I heard him walk up the stairs. But Carrie, thank you. You're getting to what I'm wondering is what did it feel like to just sit in silence for 60 seconds? Feel free to put it in a chat. And then Carrie, do you mind just expanding one or two more sentences for the eternity piece? What was the feeling during that eternity?
Hi, sure. I can elaborate a little bit. So I just kept looking at my watch like, my goodness, hasn't it already been 60 seconds and then was immediately distracted trying to find something else to do,
Mm,
which is sad because 60 seconds is really not that long. But I felt really just every second to me felt like it was taking a really long time. So, and I've
yeah.
never done something like this before exactly. So it was a really good exercise.
Yeah, I love your observation for yourself, right? Like, you know, logically 60 seconds isn't long, but it feels really long when you're just listening and not putting out anything. That's really great. And you were not alone. There are other people in the chat that said that. Brianna also mentioned how it was forcing her to breathe. We're going to do this exercise one more time. So for those of you who are uncomfortable, this style that we're going to do the second time may be a helpful way to listen and give your brain a little more to do. So rather than just listening passively, we're going to activate the listening a little bit more. So when I tell you to begin listening this time, I want you to imagine that you're actually in a sound installation. So as you're listening, every single sound that you hear was deliberately put there by an artist to convey some sort of meaning to you. So in this 60 seconds, listen like an artist. That's 60 seconds again. I wonder if that experience was any different for anyone. Thank you, Rachel. Huh. Jane, how fascinating. The sound almost became, I love that idea that it became water. Thank you, Jenna. It shifted you from internal to external. Huh. Look at this. This is really lovely. There's no wrong way to do this exercise either. But for some people, like listening, it is important as we build our capacity to listen to spend some time in silence, because silence is part of listening. And it's not really silence, as you all discovered. There's a whole lot that is happening in that silence. And for some people, it is easier to cultivate that practice by doing the more, what I'll call the first way, which is a little more meditative. You're just letting the sounds come and go. You're not trying to do anything. But for some people, that actually can be quite uncomfortable, or they can't stop their mind from thinking. And in that case, putting a frame around your listening can be really helpful. Oh man, I'm gonna so love looking back through the chat at how you experienced the artist's work as you listen to this. Thank you all for being so participatory. So if we were all athletes in building our capacity, we would hit the gym, right? We would do things outside of the act of our sport. So when we're cultivating our ability to listen, we want to do things like allow ourselves to have silent moments, not looking at a device, not listening to podcasts in our ears, increasing our capacity to calm ourselves and just let the sounds be there. But there are other strategies you can employ to build that capacity, many of which you might already do. One is you can explore writing at the beginning of every day. Try to remove some of the thoughts from your head so that you are able to listen more clearly later in the day. You can deliberately remove distractions, as I did when I removed my watch, especially if you know you want to listen deeply. And then another great opportunity is to make sure that you are incorporating exercise and ways to physically get energy outside of your body. I know for many people, physical activity is actually very, very important for their ability to listen well. But no matter what, as you build this muscle daily, ideally, then you can really be ready for those moments when you want to listen. I'm going to pause here for any reflections or questions before we move into our listening levels and setting an intention. Feel free to come off mute if you just want to ask your question aloud. Great. And Erin or Lee, have I missed anything in the chat that we should talk about?
I know everyone's been so active in the chat. It makes for such a rich conversation. Thank you to everyone who keeps contributing. And please do feel free to raise your hand or come off of mute if you want to participate.
Thanks, Erin. Thanks. All right. So we're building our capacity. We've got great muscles. The next thing we might be able to do that can be helpful in cultivating our ability to listen is to set an intention for how we want to listen. We listen all the time. It's actually a sense you cannot fully turn off. You could put noise canceling headphones in, but even then, you're going to hear the sounds of your body because your ears can't stop working. But the question really becomes, how well are we listening? And critically, how well do we need to be listening in that moment? Because I'm not going to judge. I think every level of listening is a useful level of listening. Stephen Covey helpfully named the 5 levels of listening, and each level exists for a reason, and it can be useful under the right circumstances. So as we go through the levels, we're going to talk a little bit about what each might look or feel like, but also when to employ them. And this will be when we do our breakout activity. We're going to send people away to talk about when to use that level of listening. So the first level of listening is ignoring. Not really listening at all. This is where you're not even registering what someone is speaking to you, is saying to you, or maybe you've drowned out the noises around you. So while ignoring is not a really great choice if someone is truly trying to engage you in conversation, it's actually a really important skill to have because it allows you to focus on the task at hand. And without the ability to ignore, you would never be able to have a conversation in a crowded room. So I'm not judging ignoring. It actually has a useful purpose. Feel free in the chat if there's any time that you think ignoring is a good choice, just write ignoring and then when. I'm going to move to the next level though. The next level of listening is pretending. I think if there's anyone in your life that you spend a lot of time with, especially if you have kids or a spouse, you're going to find that you have times when you need to pretend to be listening. So what does pretending look like? It looks usually like nodding and some yeahs. It might look like listening, but on the inside, you might just be making a shopping list as you're listening because your mind is elsewhere. Pretending actually, I think, is a good social purpose. You're trying to at least demonstrate a certain level of care, even if you don't have the ability to listen deeply. And just be truthful. There are some days at the end of a long work day when I'm tired and I've listened to people all day long, when my husband wants to tell me about the latest video game he's really excited about, I pretend to listen to him. Total transparency. It's the best I can do in that moment. If you can think of another good opportunity of when pretending is a good choice for listening, just write pretending and then add that opportunity in the chat for everyone. These next 3 levels, I'm going to just introduce the level, and then you'll be going into a breakout room to discuss them in groups. So the next level up the ladder is selective listening. Finally, we are actually listening to what the other person is saying. But in this case, we are listening in order to speak. So like you can think you're in a meeting and you're selectively listening for specific words or ideas that are important to you so that you can jump in and share what you wanted to share. You might also be using this level of listening sometimes if you have a message you need to land. That way you can find ways to talk about the thing you want to talk about. Very useful level of listening in persuasive situations. The next level of listening is attentive listening. At attentive listening, you are taking in all of the words that the other person is saying, not selective words, and you're not formulating your response as they're speaking. And at attentive listening, you might also be taking in a little more than their words. You might be observing some of their body language and their tone. This level requires a bit more focus. It's good for when you want to fully understand, like in a one-on-one meeting. And then the highest level of listening, and also the most exhausting level of listening, is empathetic listening. It takes a lot of energy to do this listening because not only are you doing everything at attentive, you're listening to the words, the body language, the tone of voice, the emotional content, you're also listening to your internal response to that content. So you're managing to balance both at the same time. This level of listening is often used by therapists because they need to hear what you're saying, but also kind of use their own internal response as a guide without letting themselves become the center focus. It's quite difficult. So before we move into our breakout rooms, does anyone have any clarifying questions about the 5 levels of listening? Okay, then here's what we're going to do in the breakout room. We're going to allow you to have a nice discussion with everyone in the breakout room. And here's what you're going to talk about. You're going to talk about selective listening, or attentive listening, or empathetic listening. Start with one of them. You can pick in your group. And the first thing you want to talk about at that level of listening is, what does it look like to the other person? And also, what does it feel like internally to do that level of listening? And then think about those situations and talk about what situations that level of listening is a really good choice. No judgment. What is it that makes that a good choice? Try to be really specific here if you can. What questions do you have about what you're going to be talking about in that room? I will share that slide once you're all in the breakout room so you'll be able to see it. And we're going to give you about 7 minutes. We'll bring you back after that. So on that note, Lee, are you ready to send people into some breakout rooms?
Yep, I'm just going to open them now.
Thank you. All right, we might have Celeste and Sonia in here because you might not be able to go into the other breakout room. Are you able to talk so we can talk about the activity? That's all right. What we'll do is it'll be just a few minutes. So if you're listening, that's okay, Sonia. If you're just listening along, that's totally fine. We'll be back at 12:47, I believe, since that's when we sent them out. Everybody, welcome back. Everyone's going to be coming back rapidly now. Let's see here. Welcome back, everybody. Let's hear a couple of examples of what you talked about in your breakout room. So if someone's willing to come off mute, whose group talked about selective listening, who's willing to tell us one time or place when you talked about selective listening being a great active choice? And other people feel free to put selective in the chat.
I think one of the things that we said was for self-preservation.
Tell me more about that, Katie.
That
was
wasn't me,
Laverne.
sorry, that was Laverne.
Oh, sorry, Laverne.
Yeah, when the conversation is going to a place where it may not necessarily be a healthy conversation for you,
Ah,
and you have to protect what's going on with you in order to stay engaged in the conversation.
sure. Laverne, with that protecting not only you, would you also say you could extend that to maybe protecting the purpose of the meeting or the
Oh,
purpose
absolutely.
of the mission? Yeah.
Stay on task, to stay on
Mm-hmm.
task, what you were intending the conversation to be about.
That's a great example of when selective listening is going to help you to redirect back to what's most important. Love it. Love it. Thanks, Jane. It's never enough time in the breakout rooms. We hear it every time. Maybe we should just do breakouts from now on. Uh, let's do active listening. Is anyone willing to come off mute to share a time that your group talked about when that not active, when that attentive listening is a really important choice to make?
Well, I had shared with my group that I have a teenage daughter, and when she was like in middle school, she'd come home with these emotions of something that happened at school, right?
Yeah.
And she would start to dive into the story, and before she started, I'm like, before you start, let me ask you, do you want me to help you solution for what the issue is? Do you want to just vent about it? Or do you want me to fix it? Because I can always step in and fix it, you know? And she's like, I just need a vent right now. I'm like, okay, go. So like I was always trying to like focus like what was my part in this conversation. And I find that I also do that at work too when people come in. Sometimes employees just want to vent, or sometimes they want to brainstorm or bounce ideas off of you. So I'm always asking, like, so before you get started, are you looking for me to help, or you just want to vent? And so then that's an opportunity for me to then pay closer attention that I'm actually what they need in that moment.
Can I ask one follow-up question from that? If they
Yeah.
say that they just need to vent, what level of listening, as I defined them, do you think might be the best there? Selective, attentive, or empathetic?
If they're needed a vent, probably empathetic will be helpful in there, because then you're like, because like trying to put yourself in their shoes. For me, I'm like, I start to pay attention to see if I'm noticing patterns.
Mm-hmm. I
If
love
this is if this is the situation, if this person is it if my child or employee complaining about the same person over and over again, is there a pattern that I'm noticing? Is there something that I need to insert myself in to help with? But like
Right.
you're paying attention to patterns at that point.
Yeah, that higher level listening, at least attentive, sounds like maybe where you would definitely need to be there as well. That's great. Let's do that highest level of listening then, empathetic listening. When is a time when it would be important to put all of your energy into that empathetic listening, knowing you can't do it all the time? What did you talk about in your groups?
I had said some that I tend, because I find that particular part of listening fairly draining, I do tend to save it for the people who I most want to give it to. And I know that sounds really selfish, but it does tend to be reserved for, spouse, kids, very, very close friends.
Mhm.
And joking, occasionally, you're talking about, husbands, and they'll start talking about a video game. Like, that's not one of the good uses of that. But there are
No.
times when absolutely it is. And so But yeah, and again, I realize my statement does come off as a little on the self-indulgent side, quite frankly, but again, hearing someone else say that using one of them for self-preservation meant a lot to me too. So I also think that, you know, maybe not using the empathetic quite as much might be a way of self-preserving myself as well.
Yeah. One thing I heard, Melody, that I might be able to expand upon what you said, the people that you mentioned, like your spouse or good friends, things like that. What I hear is maybe the category is when the relationship is the primary thing to pay attention to. The empathetic listening might be helpful, especially if there is emotional content being shared. Also, if you're a therapist, you're probably being paid for it. So maybe that's another time that you want to use it. You know, the point of this exercise really is just to get you thinking about an intention when you walk into the room, because you may easily be pulled out of listening if you don't know where you want to be. And to be gentle with yourself, as Melody was pointing out, and Erin was feeling you in the chat, there are times when it's okay to say, this is a point at which I need selective listening, because the most important thing today is the message. And this is a point when I'm talking to someone who reports to me and they're struggling, and I need to take the time and energy to slow down to really listen at a higher level. That's all we're calling to here right now with that intention. And if you, oh, I should go back to my share here. So on your own, you can always do check-ins like this, where you think back to conversations that you've had. Ask yourself, what level of listening were you embodying, and was it the one you intended to embody? And were there any barriers that got you off track? Just so you can constantly be improving, just like an athlete. Thank you. So, as we move to our next section, this is really about the hows of listening well. And we're going to have time to practice a couple of hows here. And this quote really inspires me when I think about listening, which is that it's about leaning in softly with an openness and willingness to be changed by what we hear. And this is about utilizing listening practices. And the first practice we're going to talk about today is about your listening position. Are you listening actively, where you are preparing to engage? Or are you listening passively, where you are allowing the information to come to you? Are you listening reductively, where you're trying to figure out what the ultimate purpose is? Or are you listening expansively and not trying to come to conclusions? Are you listening critically? Or are you listening empathetically? More than likely, you're not doing one or the other. But if we practice the ability to consciously do one or the other, we can get better at switching when we need to, because we're probably going to need to switch back and forth multiple times in any one conversation. So we are going to practice one of these dichotomies I told you about, and this is listening for facts or listening for emotion. And for this exercise, I need one volunteer who's just willing to talk about their organization and a project maybe that you're working on at your organization. So go ahead and raise your hand if you're willing to share with everyone some project that you're working on in your organization for the good of the group. I don't know if I can see all of these. Looking for a hand raise. I know I'm asking people to do like it feels like public speaking moment. Erin, I'm wondering if you're feeling well enough. Is there a project you could talk about that the Columbus Foundation is working on?
Actually, you know what I was thinking? I was thinking maybe if we pause the recording, people would be willing to share a project from their organization.
Oh, that's a great idea. Let's pause the recording. Help you. Thank you, Erin. We're talking about RASA now, and how RASA is an acronym to remember how to let someone else feel heard. So it is about listening, but also about the other person. So the R in RASA literally stands for receive. This is about looking at the person while they're talking, not interrupting them, and being open to that conversation. It's table stakes, right? The next level is to appreciate and show appreciation as you listen. So for many people, this might look like head nods, mm-hms, maybe smiles. There's some sort of active engagement back and forth. And again, this sounds like it would be easy all the time, but I'll be vulnerable here. When I have an emotionally charged conversation with my husband, I have a habit where as he's sharing things, I stop showing things. Now, for me, it's because I'm wanting to stay grounded and not let my emotions take over me. But sometimes to me, he'll say, I cannot tell what you're thinking. Are you even listening to me? And I think of myself as a good listener. So this appreciate phase is really important, and it can become difficult when there are emotional things that are happening for some people. The S in RASA stands for summarizing. This is where when the person is finished, you reflect back something that you heard. Here's what I'm hearing. And then lastly, the A, last A in RASA, is for asking questions. These are following up with questions that truly allow someone to feel that you heard them deeply and what you're curious about based on what they said. And these questions really come in two flavors. There are clarifying questions. These are going to be yes, no, or definitive answer kind of questions. A clarifying question for Kelly would be, what is the date of the gala, Kelly, if I want to go?
November 14th.
And where could I get my tickets?
On our website at jazzartsgroup.org.
Thank you. Great clarifying question. Probing questions, on the other hand, are questions that are going to dig a little bit deeper and say, my probing question for you, Kelly, might be, how did you decide on the speakeasy theme? You don't have to give the whole answer if you don't want to, but.
So, in fact, the concert that the CJO had to cancel when COVID officially in March of 2020 was going to be a speakeasy themed concert.
Oh, so it's a callback. You didn't get to
And
do
that was,
it.
yeah, it was kind of like an inadvertent realization that we realized that. I think we initially came up with it because we thought it would be cool. But in fact, that's actually what happened. The show that they could not perform was going to be that kind of a theme. So we decided to lean into that for our second kind of homecoming gala. You think about that.
I love it. It's a homecoming in multiple ways then, right? Back to the original idea. And it is cool. You're right. So this RASA technique with practice is a great way to make sure that other people feel heard when you're actively working on listening anyway. So the last thing we're going to talk about today, we're going to do very briefly. And I'm going to send a follow-up video with the materials. So Erin, when you send the materials to everyone, you'll have a video link that you can share with everyone. Because, no matter how much you set a really great intention, something might happen that pushes you into stress in that moment, or something happens that pulls you out of listening. And in those moments, you may find yourself in one of the 4 stress responses. There's fight. Fight is where you might dig your heels in. You want to win. You want to beat the other person in some way. And when you're in fight mode, you may find your listening goes quickly down to selective because you're really working to win. There's flight. Flight is when you want to leave, obviously, right? And so flight shows up in all sorts of ways. But in listening, fleers usually fall down into the pretending phase of listening. Their brain isn't fully engaged. They are actually thinking of all the other things that might be happening. Freeze is another stress response. Freeze is when someone's brain stops working. You kind of have to feel like you restart your brain there. I'm a freezer. And unfortunately, when you freeze, you actually can't form short-term or long-term memories. So freezers will not remember what they've heard. And then fawners. Fawning is the action of trying to please others. We see it in our pets all the time when they do something bad and they try to love us or they roll on their backs. So fawning can also inhibit our listening because we over-index on the nods and smiles, even if we disagree. So we're not listening to ourselves in that moment. We're just trying to please the other person. And ultimately, to pull yourself out of that stress response, you may need an anchor. And these are the three main categories of anchors that we teach people in our public speaking practice. And they will be covered more deeply in the video I send you. But one prong and way to ground yourself when those stressors happen have to do with breathing. I'm sure many of you would, if I asked, how do you handle things when it gets stressful? Many of you would say, I take a breath. Absolutely, breathing can help. And there are many breathing techniques that you can use. You can use things like box breathing before you have a conversation, or deep breathing before you have a deep conversation so that you can increase your capacity to listen and reground when you need to. The second category right in the middle there is to use your body. Actually ground yourself through something physical. You could touch something cold. You could take a drink and focus on the sensation of that drink. You could wiggle your toes. Anything that puts you inside your body will help to reduce the stress response. And then lastly, you could also try using the brain. And the brain is the world of mantras. What can you say to yourself to help ground yourself? For some people, it might sound like a cheerleader. You got this. For some people, it might sound more comforting, like you're okay. And for some people, it might be more externally focused of their mantra, something like, it's not about you. By combining these three different strategies of breath, body, and brain, you can create a more resilient practice to overcome stressful moments that can pull you out of listening. I'm going to stick around for additional questions, but we always want to make sure we end on time. So to end the formal part of our time today, I just invite you, I'm going to give a quiet moment for you to think about what you might want to play with more. What action do you want to commit to in order to cultivate greater listening? You all are going to get some great materials from us. I hope they are helpful. They're shared with great generosity and love for the good that you all do in our communities. So I hope that they are helpful. You'll get a copy of this video from Erin. You're going to get my slides. You'll get a building a listening practice worksheet that you can use for quick hits of how to build that practice. And you'll also get a video about that stress management, because we really believe in what you're trying to accomplish, and listening is such a big cornerstone of doing that well. I appreciate you all. We have a survey. I'm going to put it in the chat for you as well, because we always love to hear what you're thinking. And I'm going to stop my share to just look at you all and say thank you so much. Erin, is there anything you want to share before we invite people, if they need to leave, and I'll
Just a
stick around?
huge thank you to you for guiding us through such a timely and thoughtful session. If folks have just one more minute, I just have a short spiel for you. Next month is the final installment of this communication series, and it's actually going to be in person here at the Columbus Foundation on Wednesday, September 10th, and it'll be a lunch and learn session. So in the coming days, you'll receive, in addition to all of those materials that Acacia mentioned, an Eventbrite link to register for the workshop, which will have an attendance cap. So it's limited to 2 people per organization. The topic is influential storytelling, and it'll be led by Blythe Coons, Acacia's esteemed colleague at Articulation. You've all been excellent listeners and participants again. Thank you again to Acacia at Articulation. Before you go, a quick reminder, just complete the survey, watch your inbox for that follow-up email. And if you'd like to revisit today's tools or share them with colleagues, Articulation's website is a great resource, articulationinc.com. Thank you for joining us and for the work each of you do every day to lead, listen, and serve your community with courage and care. Take care, and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you all.